all, I wanted to jump back into Maya to continue with this model, give you guys some advice on starting out your low poly models, how to add and refine some detail to your current blockouts. And I also wanted to go over how you can start with the UV unwrapping in a really simple way. I know that the course doesn't do a super in-depth job of going over UV unwrapping, and for a lot of you it's one of the first times that you're doing this, so I did want to give an alternative way that's really easy and a good starting way to start to grasp that. So let's go ahead and jump in to refining and adding some details here. I did, before we start, want to mention that I had a couple questions about keeping under that 5,000 to 7,000 polygon limit, because that's what we're aiming for the final sculpted version of the model, is that 5,000 to 7,000 polygons. So the blockout, the requirement was 200 to 400 polygons, and now we have such a range to work in between that 400 and 5,000 to 7,000 range. And it doesn't give you like a specific number to aim for. So if you wanted advice on what to aim for, I would personally suggest aiming between 600 would be the low end, and 2,000 would be more the high end of the polygons for your low poly model, because that will give you plenty of space to continue to add detail in that sculpting stage, to be able to multiply the polygons that you have there in order to add detail in specific areas. It's totally okay if you go above that 600 to 2,000 guideline. Just make sure that you have some space between where you end up and that 5,000 to 7,000 polygon range so that you can add details when we're sculpting. So that's all I wanted to go over beforehand. Let's actually jump into it now. I'll stop rambling at you guys. So let's go ahead and add some details to this low poly model. I'm going to suggest a few things. If you want to add fingers specifically, we'll start out there. I had some questions about that, so that's where we'll start for today. So again, the edge loop tool can be your best friend, like we were talking about last week, because that edge loop tool is going to only work with quads. It only cuts quads, and also because it only cuts quads, it's going to end up creating quads in turn. So what we can do with that is really easily add geometry to our model that we can continue to refine. But it is going to add a whole lot of geometry. Like if I wanted to add a finger to my character, I'm just going to cut his hand in half for now and pretend I'm splitting it into like 2 fingers. If I wanted to add fingers to my character, maybe adding 1 edge loop is fine because we could use that to refine other areas of his body. But I don't necessarily need, if I were to add more edge loops, I'm now adding so many polygons along the side of my character here that I really only needed these polygons in the fingers. So that's when we can start to, we're going to need to start to use the multi-cut tool, because it's adding so many polygons where I can show you how many we're ending up with just with adding those edge loops for the fingers. We're now at 664 polygons when we were at 400, a little under 400 when we stopped last time. So that can really add up to your poly count really quickly if you're adding everything with edge loops. So we'll start to tackle a little bit of the multi-cut tool today. So I am going to leave this 1 cut down the middle of the hand, because I do think that that 1 edge loop is going to be beneficial for us for adding details along the side of our character. So we'll go ahead and we'll use 1 edge loop there, but then we'll jump in with the multi-cut tool to start to add the other fingers without having to add so many new polygons in order to add just these fingers. So once you have that cut across there, I'm going to jump to Mesh Tools Multi-Cut. And I did explain this a little bit last week, where you have to be a little careful with this tool because you can create some n-gons. So I'm going to explain that again just in case anyone forgot. how that works. So multi-cut, you can create a point on an existing line or an existing edge, and then we can connect it to a already existing point, or we can connect it to a new point on another edge. So for fingers, this can be really beneficial because we can add a line across that's going to cut and be our fingers. But if I hit enter and I set that, you'll start to notice that even though things look like quads, like this bottom of the finger kind of looks like a quad, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 edges to this. And we also have 5 vertices to this. And we want to work with quads which have 4 vertices and 4 edges, because quads give us so much more opportunities to work with, first of all, because we can use things like the edge loop tool, which can't cut through n-gons and can't cut through tries. And also, Mudbox, which we'll be doing the sculpting in, really does not like n-gons. Because n-gons, when we try to break them down into smaller pieces, our computer can get pretty frustrated with that, where it takes a lot of power to try to break these down, but it also is really challenging to break these down in good ways. So when we try to break down n-gons for things like animation or for things like sculpting, it can cause some pretty crazy visual issues if it even lets you break these down. So a lot of times if you have n-gons, if it even lets you pull your model into Mudbox, it won't let you refine and add detail in Mudbox around those areas because it doesn't want to try to demolish that n-gon into different pieces. So that's a really big reason why we want to avoid these n-gons. But we can still avoid these n-gons even if we're using the multi-cut tool by continuing to cut pieces and continuing to resolve n-gons. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this point here and connect it under the finger to the end of the finger there. And now this n-gon has been broken up into 2 quads. Then you need to look at where we've affected from here, because now we have another n-gon that we've caused. And that's totally fine. Just make sure you're aware of the n-gons you're causing as you use the multi-cut tool, so that we know what we need to resolve. So with that in mind, I'm just going to go ahead and continue to finish the fingers here. And I'm going to ignore the fact that we're creating an n-gon here for now. We'll jump back to that later. So I'm going to just go ahead and do the same thing that we just did with adding line between the pinky finger and the ring finger here. And same thing, I'm going to hit enter. We've now created n-gons, so we'll resolve these ones. Now we have an n-gon down here. We'll resolve these ones, but we are going to create another n-gon up here. So now we're at this point where we have these sort of fingers, but first of all, they're not separated, which I'll tackle in a moment. And second, we do have n-gons on the front side of our hand and the back side of our hand with these geometries that do look like quads, but they aren't quite. So I'm going to show you how we can start to resolve these n-gons by creating more quads by connecting to pre-existing vertices. So if we create connections to pre-existing vertices, we're not cutting an edge in half. So if you see, if I connect this to this, I've now made a quad and a tri here, and I've not made anything else into an n-gon. So by connecting to pre-existing points, we don't need to cut an edge in half, and we're not continuing to make n-gons. So that can be really useful. But it can get a little bit challenging when you haven't done it a whole lot to resolve these into quads. So I'm going to help you out with the hands here, and then you can start to try to resolve n-gons on other areas of your model where you add detail. So for now, I've created this sort of shape here where we have this quad, 1, 2, 3, 4 edges, and same quad on the other side here. And now we have a try here and another try. Tries are okay. Tries can be broken down into other pieces, so Mudbox is going to be fine with those. But it does sort of limit what we can do, and they don't break down quite as cleanly. So we do want to resolve this into a quad if we can, especially since if we want to use the edge loop tool through something like this, the edge loop tool is not going to work through these tries. So let's go ahead to edge select mode. And I'll show you one thing that we can do when we have multiple tries here is we can delete this edge between the two tries. And you'll see now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 edges. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've resolved this into all quads, and we don't have any n-gons showing on this side of the arm anymore. We haven't created any more n-gons, and we've resolved these into quads. So you do want vertices to actually have an effect on your model. So because we have this extra vertice, we can start to refine the edge flow a little bit and make this hand sort of come in smoothly. And we can also, if you want to pull these ones down, we can start to refine the shape of our hand here. Yeah, so we do have these n-gons on the other side, so we'll tackle that the same exact way. So I'll go over that just one more time. What I'm doing is I'm creating a quad here, 1, 2, 3, 4, hitting enter to lock that in, connect these two existing points. We have a quad here, and now we've got those two tries. We can again, you can delete a edge between two tries, and what that does is it makes it into a quad here. So I'm just going to touch up where these vertices are so they're actually kind of doing something rather than just being along the edge of a line. And then we'll actually start to separate these fingers. And I'll show you how we'll do that in a moment, because right now they're not separated. They do kind of look like fingers to us. But if we let go of our model and we don't have it selected, so hang on, let me go to object mode and just deselect this. That detail that we added where these look like fingers, they no longer look like fingers. And we're not going to see that edge outline while we're playing our game, so it's like we've added that detail for nothing. So we do need an actual separation of our fingers here in order for that to do anything. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to extrude the fingers out of this, and this is going to actually be our character's hand here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and pull this up to where I think the fingers would start from, so the palm of my character's hand. So I'm looking at my references still. Make sure you're checking your references as you work. Even in these refining stages, we want to make sure we're sticking to our character reference still. So I'm going to pull that up to where my character's fingers start to break off from the palm of the hand. Cool. So now I've just got a stubby hand with no fingers. So what we can do to add fingers, this is going to be an easy way to add them without having to go ahead and model different faces, is we can just extrude out from these points that we've created for the fingers to come out from. So I'm going to grab one of those faces, and holding shift like last week, I'm going to go ahead and use the move tool to extrude this out. And now you can see I've got this finger here that actually has this face on the inside and on the outside. So we'll be able to even sculpt between these fingers because there's actual geometry there. So when we get to the sculpting stage, we can sculpt between those fingers. I'm going to go ahead into edge mode and also clean this up so that it looks like it's smoothly going into the finger. And we can also refine this a little bit. We could scale this finger down. That's totally fine. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and extrude the rest of the fingers out, and then I'll touch these up in a moment. So holding shift and using the move tool, I'm extruding this next finger out and then shaping it to fit with my reference. Again, make sure you're looking at your reference to make sure things are the correct size and fitting with the reference of your character. And again, we've got the faces on the inside of these. So when we go into sculpt, we could actually sculpt between these fingers and refine these, curve them out more, add some more geometry there, and we'll actually be able to affect these and not have to make a giant cut in the hand while we're sculpting to try to iron out these fingers. Again, grabbing another face and extruding this down, making sure I'm paying attention to my model sheets. And we've got another finger here. And finally, we'll add this pinky finger. Again, shift to extrude, and then letting go of that to be able to move this into place. All right, great. So that goes over the multi-cut tool really briefly, of course, but it can help you to understand how to use that and how you can start to resolve these n-gons that it may create while you're using it, and how to recognize those. So I'm going to grab the ends of these fingers, and we can do things with these like scale them in order to sort of taper off toward the end of the hand. And you can also scale the fingers more separate or more together. And you're just going to go ahead and try to make that look as good like your character's hand with these fingers as you want them to be. Cool. And again, we can grab these faces and we can continue to adjust these if you want to. And we can even adjust the finger ends individually to start to taper these off even more. All right, so that's got us a good start for the fingers, and it's going to get us in good shape for when we need to do the sculpting. And if you find the beginning of your fingers is not quite perfect to what you're liking, we can go ahead and grab these edges and we can pull them up. That can start to resemble more of the knuckles that you expect to see when fingers are coming out from your hand. Again, we can go into vertex mode as well to touch things up. Cool, so we've got this hand here. You'll notice that I didn't do it on the other side. That's totally fine. If you want to focus on just one side of your model again, that's totally okay. What we can do after we add this detail is we can cut our model in half again. We can mirror it once again, and then we don't need to add those details on both sides, and we don't need to try to add the same details on both sides. If you did want to add details on both sides, though, like after you've mirrored again and you realize you want to refine something, what you can do is you can grab things like 2 points here, and you'll notice with the move tool, obviously that's not going to mirror, but things like the scale tool you can use to scale these apart or scale them together evenly. So that can be really useful to add a little bit of detail after you've mirrored if you don't want to unmirror and then mirror again. All right, so that's a basic review of the multi-cut tool and adding more detail to your character. Edge loops are also going to be your friend in addition to trying out a little bit of that multi-cut tool. These edge loops are going to give you more geometry across your entire character that you can start to add further detail. So because I have more geometry on this upper part of the arm here, I can now start to curve out this arm, and it's not going to look as blocky as our block out phase did. It's starting to look like it's getting some detail here. And again, we can use other things like the rotate tool, or we can grab individual vertices to really try to nail things into the correct placements and get things looking good. All right, so that's how you can start to add some details once again with that multi-cut tool and continuing with edge loops. So I did want to go over that. I'm not going to go too in depth of adding every single detail to my character because I think that goes over it to a point that you can start to apply this to your own character and start to apply it to different areas. If you do have questions, feel free to let me know, of course. But I do want to jump into how you can unmirror by cutting it in half, how you can remirror for when you're ready for that stage, and then how we can start to UV unwrap our character. All right, so to cut our model in half, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to face select mode, and I'm just going to go to either my front view, or you can do this from your perspective view. Going from your front view is going to be your best bet because you can really do a good job of cutting this in half. So what we can do is we can delete the side that we added, that we didn't add detail to. So I've highlighted my entire half of the character that doesn't have that detail. I can hit that delete key, and you'll see if I jump into perspective view. This is a similar view to what we saw last week when we had modeled out half our character and then mirrored it to the other side. Your mirror settings should probably be the same still if you use the same mirror settings for both characters. So if we go to mesh mirror, it probably will do it correctly for you. But we do actually need to select our object. I forgot to grab. So mesh mirror, and you'll see I actually have changed my settings because I made a couple tutorials in between this. So what we can do if you have it go to the wrong area is we can change it in here. So this little window that pops up, I know I'm at the wrong axis because it's mirroring across a different axis than I'm wanting. So we can click on this and we can try out the different axes. That's obviously not the right one either. So I'm going to jump to this x-axis. Now we know it's the correct one, but it's mirroring the half with nothing to the half with something. So it's going in the wrong direction. So we can switch to this direction. And now I have x and negative, and our model is looking good on both sides with our details we added for the low poly model. And of course, you'll want to add more detail than I am. For this, I just wanted to go over briefly that multi-cut tool so that you can have some tips on how to add some details for that and how to resolve those n-gons. All right, so once you do have your finished low poly model and you're ready to move to the UVs, what we can do is we'll open the UV menu here. So UV editor is going to bring up this UV editor for us. So what you'll see when you get this is you'll probably not have this on and you'll probably have this on. So it's just this box that we started out with, the original box of our character. So what we can do is we can go ahead and I like to turn this checkerboard on. And what this checkerboard does is it shows you how textures are going to show up on your model. And what we want with our UVs is we want these to look like squares. So right now in the front, they do a pretty good job of looking like squares. But on the side of my character, you can see these are really stretched and warped. And that's not what we're going for. We do want things that look closest to squares as possible. It doesn't need to be perfect. But we do want things to look like squares because that means our texturing process is going to be a lot easier and our textures aren't going to stretch over our model when we try to paint this. So for the UVs, the most important thing is that you have every single face accounted for on your UV map. Because if we don't have every face accounted for on your UV map, Mudbox is not going to let you bring in your model. And if it does let you bring in your model without the complete UVs, it's not going to let you texture your model. So what we want to do is make sure we have all of the faces on there. So if you're doing the UVs yourself entirely, again, they do not need to be perfect, so don't worry about that. If you're happy to do the UVs yourself and you know where to start with that, please feel free to go ahead and do that. I'm going to show a little bit of an easier way to do UVs, a very beginner way to do it, so it's not going to be the most optimal way to do UVs, but I did want to go over a starter way to do this for people that haven't done UV unwrapping before and want to be able to get that done to be ready for the the sculpting phase of the project. So what we want to do this really easily is we can try out the automatic UVs. First, I'll show you what happens when we do the camera-based UVs, which is what I usually start with when I'm doing my actual UVs, when I'm actually unwrapping manually and making a lot of cuts. So I'm going to go ahead and do camera-based just to show you. So these camera-based UVs are showing us we've got these squares here. So the front of my model looks great because we were looking at it straight on. But as we get to the side of our model, you're seeing the stretching that we want to avoid. And back looks okay, but if you turn on this second mode, you'll see this turns red. So what's happening with the camera-based UVs is when we're looking at the character, it's looking straight through the character, and that's why we're having these backwards UVs. But when you make cuts to your character and you go to unfold, and then you go to unfold this button, when it unfolds these, it will correctly unfold them to lay out correctly and not be overlapping and not be reversed. So don't worry too much about that if you start with that. And if you are comfortable with UV unwrapping, what you want to do is go to Edge Select and start to select where you want to make your cuts. Click this Cut and Sew button, hit Cut, and then do that Unfold button, and that will start to unfold your model. I did want to show a more easy way to do that because I know we're getting toward the end of the week, we're getting toward that sculpting phase, and I want to give you guys an easy option to be able to get ready for that sculpting phase. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just selecting all my UVs I currently have, hitting delete. And now I'm going to select my whole model. And these UVs are mirrored, so I'm going to go ahead and actually grab the UVs on my other part of my character and just go ahead and delete those. So now in object mode, I'm selecting everything. And I'm going to go to create. And we're going to try out the automatic UVs. And these generally do a pretty good job here. You can see it's kind of overlapping my pieces, which is not good. And I'll explain why that's not good in a second. But you can see it's doing a pretty good job of having squares all the way around my model, which is great. This means we don't have to do too much work to refine this. But you'll also see that there's sort of areas that don't flow cleanly into one another. Like this area with the arm, it's not like the pattern's continuing in this. It's more like there's a cut here and there's another piece of the pattern continuing here. So why this isn't optimal with these automatic UVs is it sort of makes cuts wherever it feels it needs to in order to unwrap this cleanly. But these cuts aren't necessarily always in the best spots. So back in the day, this would have been more of a problem because we used to be texturing things directly onto that UV map, that texture map, a lot more commonly. Now with Mudbox and with Substance Painter, we can paint directly on our models, and we don't necessarily need to look at our UV map and our texture map while we're working. We don't need to be painting directly onto the map. So it was really important that we made cuts in areas that the player couldn't see, just in case the textures don't match up perfectly when we're painting on this area and trying to get them to connect. So here's this piece all the way over here in the UV map. Here's this piece all the way over here. It's going to be hard to paint on these in a way that it feels like it connects when they're not actually physically connecting. So it was a lot more important when we were it was a lot more important when we were painting on texture maps that we made cuts in spots that the player can't see. Again, it's not as important now, but it is good practice to still make those cuts in the proper spots. So if you know what you're doing and you can UV unwrap this more cleanly than the automatic can do, please go ahead. That's awesome. So you'll notice with the horns, it's not doing quite as good of a job. So there might be areas of your model that you notice the squares aren't looking like squares. They are starting to look stretched. So what you can do for that is we can start to unwrap things ourselves by cutting in order to fix these misalignments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to edge mode, and I'll go ahead and grab a piece of this. I believe we deleted the underside of this cone. So all we need for this cone to be able to unwrap and lay flat is we just need to make one cut of these in order for this to be able to roll out and flatten. So it's really hard to picture this sometimes, but you might get better at picturing this later on, where kind of picture this as if it's a cone made of cardboard and you want to cut it so that you can lay it flat. It's almost like recycling when you try to rip apart a box and lay it flat. Except it's weird recycling because we can't overlap layers, so we can't just squish this cone in half in order to lay it flat, because then we have that overlap. So we just need to make one cut down the side of this and we could unwrap this. So that's all we need to do. So let's grab an edge of this that we need to cut. Click this cut and sew, click cut. And I'm also going to do this on this horn. Ideally, you'd pick probably the back of a horn or the side of the horn, wherever the player is least likely to see. And you'd go cut and sew, cut. And now we've made those cuts, but nothing's changed on our UV map. So how we can fix that is we go to face select mode on the UV map, go ahead and select everything, or hit select all, totally works as well. Go to this unfold tab here and click unfold. And now you'll see it's cleaned up those areas. You'll see it's kind of visible where we made that cut because it's actually separated here, but it is unfolded. It's only doing it on that one, so I don't know why it's up with that. But this will texture fine as long as we're painting directly onto the model, like I mentioned previously. Might be a little bit harder if you were painting directly onto the texture map. But yeah, now everything looks like squares. So really, if you have any stretched part of your character where those squares are getting stretched, all you want to do is figure out how you can unfold that cleanly and flat and make cuts as if you were using scissors along those. Try out unfolding, see if it fixes it. If it doesn't, make some more cuts and try it out again. All right, so that should help with the UV unwrapping. We're not quite done yet though, because you'll see I have a lot of pieces overlapping. See, this part of the horn is overlapping with this part of the chest. So what's going to happen if we try to paint on this, even if we paint directly on the model, it's going to paint this area of the texture map, which is overlapping with this area of the texture map. So if I tried to paint his shirt white, this horn is also going to turn white where it's overlapping, even if we're painting directly on the model. So we really, really don't want this overlap, because then we don't have control over how we're texturing our model. So what we can do to stop this overlap without having to go in and move everything individually is we can go ahead and select everything and go to modify and then layout. And you'll see now we don't have any overlap here. It usually gives you a little bit of distance between these UV islands, is what they're called, these different sections. Again, you can see it's making way more cuts than necessary because these are the automatic UVs. So again, not ideal, but it is a way to UV unwrap in a way that we'll be able to texture this and we'll be able to sculpt next week. One thing to keep in mind as well if you use this layout, I'm going to show you my layout settings just in case I have anything changed. These are my layout settings here. I believe they're the default settings, but I just wanted to show you. So what we can do, what problem can happen when we use this layout button is, and I'm not sure if it's been fixed, but I remember this used to be a problem, so I am going to point it out, and I am going to point out how to resolve it just in case anyone runs into this. But sometimes when you use that layout button, it will lay these tiles really, really close to the edge, to the point that they're right up on the edge of this. And mine aren't doing that right now, so I just moved mine to show you what that looks like. But we don't want it to touch the edge completely, because what can happen is Mudbox can get a little bit confused when it's overlapping the edge. It gets upset that there's pieces that are outside of the UV map. So if you bring in your model to Mudbox next week and it gets mad at you about that, what you need to do is just shrink these just a pinch so that it's not overlapping the edge there. And I'll show you how to do that. So you could go along the edge of your UV map and just make sure there's no overlap on that edge. Or if you think there might be overlap, go ahead and select everything. Again, you can use select all. And I'm going to use the scale tool. All of these tools work in the UV menu as well, which is great. So the move tool, the rotate tool, you can continue to move and rotate and scale things in here. And I'll explain how that can be useful in other ways in a moment. But we can use this scale tool and just go ahead and scale this everything in just a pinch. And you'll see now everything's a little bit further away from that edge. And we don't really need to worry about that being a problem anymore. So that's how you would solve that if you have that problem come up. And then I did want to talk about being able to scale and rotate things in the UV menu. So you can see my horn is really huge, or this half of my horn is huge in this UV menu. And my horn on my character doesn't really need a whole lot of detail. If I needed a whole lot of detail, that's great. The bigger something is on the UV map, the more detail you can add to it. So the more squares something has, or the smaller squares something has, means you can add more detail to it. So I really don't need that amount of detail on my horns. So if we wanted to, I could scale this down. And that leaves space for other things where I might want more detail. So instead, I might want more detail around my head area of the model. I might want detail where the eyes are. So I could go ahead and grab this UV island. Whoa. Apologies, I pressed the wrong button there. I could go ahead and grab this UV island, and how you can grab the whole island without having to select individual faces is I'm holding right click and I'm going to UV shell, and that lets you select a whole island here. And now if I wanted more detail in this area, I can clear out some space for that. Again, this piece of the horn doesn't need to be big. I can make that smaller. I can move it. I can rotate it to fit, make sure there's no overlap once again, because that overlap can be a problem. Now I've got more space for this area where my eye is going to be on. And again, I'll want to do this to the other eye as well, if I were to make these changes. And we can scale that up and sort of lay this out. And you do want to leave a little bit of space between your UV islands. You don't want them overlapping and you don't want them way too close to each other, because sometimes the texture can leak if they're too close. So you'll see now I have the smaller squares on this side, which means I can add more detail on this side than I could on this side, which we don't want when we're mirroring something like that. So you would want to use these together. You'd want to scale those together and make sure they're the same size if you're going to be mirroring your texture. Anyway, so don't need to make those changes, but if there's areas where you realize I don't need many details on these horns, but I do need details in other areas where there's less, there's smaller UV islands, but I want more details on those, like maybe the hands. These hands are pretty small, especially compared to the horns. I might want to resize those and be able to have more detail when we get to texturing. Not the biggest deal. Most important thing is you have every single face on this UV map, or Mudbox won't let you pull it in. And other most important thing is that nothing is overlapping. All right, so that pretty much goes over everything I wanted to go over. Simple review of that multi-cut tool, adding more detail, and a simple go over of how you can create your UVs and be ready for next week, even if you're not super comfortable with UV unwrapping yet. All right, so I hope this helps. Have a good one. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.